co-chair of the board of the Inter-American Dialogue and will be moderating a conversation with our featured speaker, Michèle Flournoy. She's a former U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Flournoy was a principal advisory to the Secretary of Defense in the formulation of national security and defense policy, oversight of military plans and operations, and in National Security Council deliberations. She's also co-founder and managing partner of WestExec Advisors and former co-founder and CEO of the Center for New American Security, a bipartisan think tank dedicated to developing strong, pragmatic, and principled national security policies. She was also a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies for several years, and prior to that, a distinguished researcher professor at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Ambassador Tom Shannon has spent more than 30 years in the U.S. Foreign Service, most recently as Undersecretary of the State for Political Affairs, the third highest ranking position at the State Department. During his career, Ambassador Shannon served in the U.S. Foreign Service at embassies in Guatemala, Brazil, South Africa, and Venezuela. Mr. Ambassador, I'm sorry to tell you, I'm not sure if you know yet, but there's no more U.S. Embassy in Venezuela. He's currently also a senior international policy advisor for Arnold & Porter. Please help me welcome Ambassador Shannon and Michèle to the stage.
Well, good afternoon. What a tremendous pleasure to be here today at the Willard Hotel at the CAF conference, celebrating the CAF and the Inter-American Dialogue. And we welcome all of you, delighted to have you here today, and are looking forward to a tremendous conference. And to start, we are extraordinarily lucky to have with us Michèle Flournoy. You heard her biography today, an extraordinary career as a national security professional, a great public servant, a great public intellectual, and now a great private sector leader as one of the founders and managing partners of WestExec Advisors. I can think of no one better to understand the current global security environment we face today, both strategically but also politically, and to understand how it links to our larger concerns here at the CAF conference, which is to our hemisphere and especially to Latin America. But also looking into the future to understand how those global security challenges link with the globalization that is happening in our own hemisphere, especially in Latin America. So, Michèle, thank you for being with us. We're honored to have you here. And I think it might be good to start with taking a kind of a panoramic view of the world and understanding where you think the major global security challenges are right now. And then we can begin to understand how Latin America links to that.
Sounds good. Thank you for inviting me, and it's an honor to share the stage with Ambassador Shannon. So I guess I would start, based on the introductory remarks, with China. We all see the rise of China, and for many years in the United States anyway, across multiple administrations, the Bush administration and the Obama administration, the expectation was that as China rose as a power in influence, that we could influence their calculus and invite them into the rules-based international order and help them to become a responsible stakeholder, a great power that was helping to maintain the international order and evolve the system. And I think several administrations and many of our allies and partners put a lot of effort into trying to make that a reality. But I think what we've seen in the last 5 to 7 years, really under President Xi's leadership, is a China that is sort of, as China watchers say, dropping the veil. A China that is revealing itself to be a much more assertive and in some situations aggressive power that does not necessarily accept the rules of the road in Asia or more broadly. And so China is rising and revealing itself to be more of a revisionist power. And that poses a very different challenge for the United States and for all of us, in that Economically, we've seen China's unfair trade practices that make it very difficult for Western firms in terms of protecting their intellectual property, having fair access to the Chinese market, and so forth. We've seen them in my world, in the military sphere, starting to develop capabilities that are quite worrisome and are really seem to be pointed at giving them options to resolve long-standing disputes over territory and resources and sovereignty claims by force, if necessary. And we've started to see them exercising some of those capabilities. What you were seeing right now in the economic zone of Vietnam, for example, where China's using very coercive means. So I think the question is, how do we both compete effectively with China, but also find areas of cooperation, climate change, proliferation, and so forth, but also continue to try to incent China to play by the rules, or at least deter them from not using outright aggression to try to change the status quo?
In that regard, obviously China is a big issue here in Washington now, and there's a lot of debate about how to address China. There seems to be a growing consensus around the idea that you mentioned of trying to require China to be responsive to the needs of other countries and global rules of the road. But there seems to be a division in Washington itself about how you do that and what the ultimate purpose is, and whether or not you can have an accommodation with China or whether the United States needs to decouple from China in some fashion. How would you frame that, and what would be your recommendation?
So, I think we all recognize the China problem. My concern is that the U.S. approach is not likely to be effective and actually may have some second and third order effects that are harmful to us. So what do I mean by that? First of all, when you talk about the trade issues, the unfair practices, these are not issues that the United States alone is dealing with. Many of our allies in Europe, in Asia, Latin America, elsewhere, we're all dealing with this. It would have been far more effective to band together as like-minded states to try to, and use the institutions we have, like the WTO, to push back on China collectively. When we've seen that happen in say, the security domain, in ASEAN, for example, when the countries of the region have pushed back against behavior that China, where they've crossed a line or they've gone too far, China tends to take a step back. But we've deprived ourselves of that natural strength by treating this as a strictly bilateral problem and by using the very narrow metric of trade balances and using tariffs as a tool. So I think I would like to see an approach that really uses the institutions and the tools that we have, creates a coalition of states that want to push back on China, and I think that's much more likely to get an appropriate response from China. This notion of decoupling, I mean, honestly, in a globalized environment, economy, where you have international supply chains for almost every product or that you can think of, I don't know what that means. I mean, I'm all for building very high walls around national security technologies and capabilities that we absolutely want to protect. But I don't think it's in our interests to try to disintegrate China. A, I don't think it's really possible. B, I think it would be costly to us. And C, if you ever want to, if it really comes to a potential conflict with China, one of the ways to deter them from taking an aggressive move is to help them realize how much cost they would bear as an integrated economy. You want them to feel the pain of being integrated into the international system and all that the costs that would bring if they chose to launch aggression.
China has replaced the United States as the #1 trading partner in several South American countries of significant importance to the United States, such as Brazil, such as Chile, Peru, and others. This has been an area of concern for the United States. We still dominate in the area of added value trade, and the economic relationship between these countries and the United States, while maybe not as large in terms of volume, is certainly better in terms of quality. However, as China begins to move up the technological scale, and especially as it begins to show an intent to dominate in areas like 5G and elsewhere, our response has been to tell our Latin partners that trusted partners are better than cheap partners or high-quality partners.
Yeah.
Is that a sustainable argument?
I don't know if it's sustainable by itself, but I do think it's worth Latin American economies that are thinking about deepening their relationship with China to go to school first on some of the cases that have occurred in Africa and in Asia. You take a country like Bangladesh that signed up to One Belt, One Road, massive infrastructure investment, but at a huge price. First of all, no real job creation because the infrastructure projects are undertaken by Chinese labor that's brought in. But to take these projects on, they had to take on massive amounts of debt. And that indebtedness is long-term, and it comes with political strings attached. And so they are now extremely vulnerable to Chinese coercion of all kinds. You don't want to be in that position, and you shouldn't have to be in that position to gain international investment or development dollars. That's the first thing. The second thing is China is using the One Belt, One Road platform to export its own technologies, to give companies like Huawei and ZTE and others an unfair advantage because with state subsidies, they're able to offer extremely low prices. The problem is with that technology comes the potential for Chinese exfiltration of data that goes through the network without the knowledge or consent of the user. And also denial of service. If there's ever a point where China's upset, they can cut off the service. Furthermore, I think in some countries it comes with a sort of ideological model in mind that says we want to build up the tools of the state to enhance surveillance, control, and so forth. And so I think there is an ideological component to the competition, and there's a very real risk that kind of deepening Chinese economic relationship can become a technological relationship, can feed the growth of what I would call a surveillance state model in some countries.
As you go down the list of potential adversaries, second to China is Russia. You spent a lot of time working on things Russian, especially in regard to Europe. How do you assess Russia in the global environment now and President Putin?
By many objective measures, whether it's economy, demographics, per capita GDP, Russia is a state that's in decline. And yet, Putin has invested heavily in keeping aspects of their military quite strong. We've just been seeing tests about new nuclear weapons that he's invested in, and particularly what I call many call gray zone tools, intelligence, information operations, little green men, proxies that can go into, that give him options to influence outcomes in places like Ukraine without, outright military occupation. And what I worry about is that you take the example of Russian interference in the American election, their use of social media, their use of cyber attacks and infiltration. When I look at and ask the question, has Putin paid any real price for that at this point? I don't think so. And so if we're thinking about how do we deter that behavior or even more aggressive behavior of that nature in the future, I don't think we've done what we need to do to really enhance deterrence of those kinds of actions. So I think we've done a good job creating military deterrence in Europe. I don't think it's very likely that Russian tanks are going to come into the Baltics because we've made that investment, and it's very clear that we are backing up our NATO allies. But short of that, That's what I worry about. I think Putin feels very free to meddle in our democracies and in our operations abroad as well, as we've seen in Syria and elsewhere.
Looking at the region and comparing Chinese and Russian behavior, I would argue that China has the capability of transforming economic presence and power into political influence. I'm not sure the same can be said of Russia. Its focus in the region has largely been on weapons sales and on purchasing oil and gas, and has not invested the kind of time and effort necessary to build political influence outside of, say, Venezuela. So in this regard, I think China is a competitor of higher order than Russia is at this time. But Russia continues to be a looming presence in Europe. And as the European Union struggles with the exit of the United Kingdom, and as the United Kingdom itself struggles with its own exit, how do you see Brexit?
I think it's one of the worst self-inflicted wounds that any EU nation could inflict on itself. It's a real it's a shame. It's a catastrophe for Britain. I think the British people, this will go down in history as one of the worst decisions in British history. I think it will affect the standard of living of the average Briton. I think it will take the UK sort of down in economic prosperity and influence in, UK has long been a country that punches above its weight. I think Brexit will cause it to punch below its weight. And that is a challenge for all of us, because Britain has been a very important ally, a very important leader in terms of rules-based order, democracy promotion, and so forth. So it is a real shame. I do think watching this slow-motion car crash of Brexit has hopefully given every other EU member that was thinking about it, given them some pause to say, maybe that's not the right answer. Maybe we need to try to reform and improve the EU rather than crash out of it.
Just a few weeks ago, it looked as if the United States might be on the verge of some kind of military conflict with Iran in the Persian Gulf. How do you see Iran at this point and the U.S. standoff in the Gulf? And what future do you see for the U.S.-Iran relationship and also security in the Gulf?
Yeah. So I do think Iran under this regime is a problem for the United States and for the region, in that their foreign policy has really been about exporting revolution and instability. You see that in their support for the Houthis in Yemen, in their support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, in their support for other proxies in Iraq, militias across the region. And so there is a very real problem there. When we looked at this in the Obama administration, we felt that the only Iran like that had nuclear weapons. And so we focused our effort first on coming to an agreement that would reduce their nuclear materials and put a lot more time on the clock of how long it would take them to actually get to a weapons capability. And the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, actually did that. It's now been faulted for not doing everything else, for not solving the ballistic missile problem, for not solving the Hezbollah problem, for not solving Iran's support for terrorism. But it was never designed to do that. It was a first step. And unfortunately, we've thrown that away. And I think we've made things worse, because the power of one of the achievements of that agreement is we brought Russia, China, EU all together on one sheet of music to try to deal with Iran effectively. We have now succeeded in fracturing that coalition, and you're seeing Iran's freedom of action as much greater, and I think they are, becoming a bigger problem. This is not a problem that has a military solution. I mean, yes, deterring Iran is important, having military options to prevent them from doing stupid acts of aggression is important, but there's no exclusively military solution. This needs a diplomatic approach that links together sanctions, deterrence, and diplomatic engagement We need to be talking to these people to try to resolve a crisis and prevent another war in the Middle East. That's not in anybody's interest.
Right. In your career, you've blended diplomacy and security. And you've talked today about the importance of linking diplomacy with security. And you talked briefly about gray zone conflicts, and especially the way the Russians have mastered keeping a conflict with us below armed confrontation. Obviously, as we get deeper into the 21st century, and especially as the United States finds a way to extract itself from Afghanistan and Iraq and rebuild military capabilities, direct confrontation with the United States will be a very deadly thing. And so there will be a premium on trying to use other aspects of national power to pursue interests. And this means that the United States and countries in our hemisphere need to think and understand security beyond military terms.
Yes.
How would you describe 21st century security?
Well, I think you're right in that you have to think of it beyond military means. Obviously, important military dimensions, that matters. But I think first and foremost, we have to think of it in terms of information and the use of information to influence publics and outcomes. And I think we're still just learning how social media platforms can be used as a very powerful tool for nefarious purposes. One of the things that keeps me up at night right now is the growing possibility of what's called deep fakes, that we will soon encounter situations where we see a video on YouTube or even on the news, and we honestly don't know if it's real or fake, made up. There's lots of technology companies now working on trying to find the technological signatures of the manipulation that creates fake video, to see if they can give it some, when you get a video, you get a confidence rating of it's 70% confident that this is accurate or 70% confident that it's been tampered with, but we're not there yet. And so we can be going into an era, as particularly dangerous for democratic societies that rely on their publics to have an informed view and to cast votes and to help make decisions, where we don't know what truth is. And it's very difficult to discern, even for those who are really working at trying to discern it. And so I think that is one of the areas that worries me most, along with cyber intrusions. There's a lot more that we can and should be doing in terms of public-private partnership to protect our data, to protect our intellectual property, and so forth. And I'd say those are areas where we need to do a lot more than we are doing.
In Latin America, a region which has emerged over the past 4 decades, from authoritarian government to democratic government, from closed economies to open economies, from exclusive societies to increasingly inclusive societies, or ones built around middle classes, and from countries that largely did not trade with each other to ones that have now pursued regional integration and trade-based growth, and also largely from global isolation to globalization. The focus on open society and promoting individual rights has been profound, and a belief that government should lie in the hands of civilians. So much of our engagement on areas like cybersecurity and on gray zone conflicts and how technology is used to undermine adversaries is really centered in our own military, our security institutions. How do we build relationships in the region, and how do we engage with our Latin American partners on issues that will be crucial to the well-being and security of their economies and their societies? In other words, how do we construct that kind of conversation?
Right. Well, first of all, I think it's extremely important that the United States and any U.S. administration recognize that we have a vital strategic interest in building and continuing to strengthen the community of free market democracies, and particularly right at home in the Americas. So that's thing one. We should care a lot about this. On the question of how do we build that capacity, I agree with you. This cannot be something that's left to security services. It's also not something that can be left to governments. When I look at the U.S. situation, the vast majority of our technical talent is not in government, it's in the private sector. And so one of the things we need to do is really double down on public-private partnerships that enable us to share talent between the private and public sector, best practices, resources, and so forth. The best example, recent example I've seen of this is something called the Paris Call, where at a conference that President Macron hosted last year, he brought together, starting with, I think, the G20 countries, but a number of countries and a number of companies like Microsoft and the big tech companies, together to sign on to a set of norms of behavior in cyberspace, and also to pledge that if someone falls under attack and doesn't have the resources to deal with it, that others will step in, kind of like a first responders, like a fire brigade, and come in and help the recovery and then the rebuilding of adequate defenses. And so I think whether it's the Paris Call or something, there's these public-private partnerships that need to be developed on an international basis where we are pooling our resources as the good guys and making it much harder for the bad guys to actually do us harm in the cyber domain.
In the area of democracy, we are a region that has committed ourselves to democratic government. Through the Inter-American Democratic Charter, we have declared democracy a right of all our peoples, and we have posited to governments an obligation to defend democracy. With a few exceptions, that is the case. Yet, the cover of Foreign Affairs magazine is called Autocracy Now! And has the images of any number of autocrats. And we're seeing, to a certain extent, a rise of autocracy or some kind of hybrid of democracy and authoritarianism. How do we manage that? How do we deal with that?
Well, I think, we have to start by looking at root causes. And in a lot of cases, I think this is, in many countries, it's sort of a backlash to the perceived downsides of globalization, whether that's in the form of immigration that makes some of the population uncomfortable, whether it's in the form of structural changes into economies that have, created job loss in certain sectors, and so forth. So I think the first thing is, when I think about this issue in the U.S. in terms of disaffection and people who might be questioning our democracy, I try to start by meeting them at their point of pain. Like there are real experiences that are giving rise to this. That said, the solution is not to embrace authoritarianism. We have to do a better job as democracies of meeting the needs of our people, whether it is in job creation that responds to the structural changes in the economies that have happened as a result of whether it's better access to higher education, whether it's investment in the drivers of innovation and job creation, science, technology, 21st century infrastructure. And, there are many economists in the room who could articulate this better than I, but I think we have to do a better job as democracies and realize that there has to be good public policy that accompanies the free, open market to ensure that as change occurs, we don't leave whole segments of our populations behind, but they come on the journey with us.
In that regard, and as we try to build a larger conversation around democracy, around trade, free trade, open markets, and inclusive societies, there is concern in the region about what is seen as the United States stepping away from leadership roles. During a trip I took recently through South America, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Colombia, typically people wanted to talk about China first, Venezuela second, and the third question was always, where is the United States? There's concern that the inward focus of the United States at this point is not only having an impact on institutions, but also how we are understood as a partner and as a leader. Is this something that worries you? And if there has been an erosion of that, can it be recovered?
It does worry me. I think it's one of the things that is, giving me the greatest pause. I do think it's recoverable if, and I don't want to be too political here, but if we have a change from our election in 2 years, I think you had a new president come in who understood the criticality of the U.S. leadership role, who understood the value of alliances, who understood the value of really assertively defending and investing in democracies, and particularly our closest partners in our home region. I think there's a certain amount of recovery that could happen. Think back to how Europe felt about the Bush administration because of Iraq and how much tension there was with our European allies over Iraq. And that all flipped pretty quickly when you had a U.S. president that set a different course and that re-embraced Europe and the importance of Europe and so forth. So I think that possibility is there. That said, I do hear from our allies and friends that they have witnessed a pendulum of U.S. foreign policy now from Reagan to Clinton to Bush and I think people get exhausted by the swinging. The swing used to be within a certain bounds of bipartisan consensus, and now it's swinging more widely. So I don't want to wish this away. I don't think we can turn back the clock and pretend that the current shift in the U.S. posture in the world never happened. But in order to get out of bed in the morning, I have to believe that a good deal of recovery is possible with the right leadership in the White House, with the right mandate from the American people, who I think, when you look at American public polling, the Pew poll, recent Pew poll, the Chicago on Foreign Relations poll, Americans understand the importance of U.S. leadership. They understand the importance of engaging with the world. They understand the importance of Latin America to American interests. So the American people have a certain wisdom on this, and we just need an administration that fully reflects that.
One of the big issues of this century has been migration, and something that has played large here in the United States. First, because of migration across our southwest border. Largely from Central America, but elsewhere, and has formed a large part of our relationship with Mexico and our Central American partners. But also more recently, migration out of Venezuela, to Colombia, to Ecuador, to Peru, to Chile, to Brazil, to Trinidad, to Panama, and beyond. But it is a global phenomenon. Estimates put migrants at the highest level in history at this point in time, with over 220 migrants or people on the move at any time, and nearly 70 million displaced peoples. How does the international community deal with this at this point in time, understanding the tremendous political impact that migration has had in Europe, here in the United States, and is now having in South America?
Well, I think that more than anything underscores the important work that all of you here do. We have the first line of defense is to invest in development and job growth and economic growth that gives people the option to have a good life at home, because that's the first choice of everyone. No one chooses to go through the hell that they go through to become a refugee or to become a migrant that traverses a continent to try to get to a place where they can feed their families and live in safety. So I really think, strategic approaches to development and focusing on what actually works. We know so much more now about what actually works. I'm on the board of CARE, and the power of investing in women and girls to transform whole communities and create entrepreneurship and access to education is something we all know now. So let's put our dollars in that direction. So I think that's the first line of defense. But then I think a very strong, rules-based legal system that is worthy of both our values and humanitarian impulses, and also protects our borders and our interests. We have found that balance as a nation before. That has really defined America for most of our history. Whether it was, the 1700s when my ancestors, French Huguenots, came from Europe, or more recently. But what we are doing right now is really a departure. It's a departure from who we are. It's a departure from our own history. It's a departure from our own traditions. And so I think we need to get back to both investing, dealing with root causes, but also when, treating migrants and refugees with far more of a humanitarian and respectful approach, while also recognizing that our economy depends on migration. There are whole sectors, whether it's agriculture. Look at Silicon Valley. Look at the CEOs and founders of Silicon Valley. There's a huge percentage of them that came from another country, and they brought their incredible creativity and their innovation to the United States of America. That's to be celebrated. That is to be welcomed. That is to be encouraged.
Ms. Flournoy has agreed to take questions from the crowd. We have about 10 minutes left.
And if they're too hard, I'm going to ask the ambassador.
But we do have simultaneous translation. So if anyone would like to ask questions, we have 2 microphones. You can ask in either English or Spanish, and I'm not sure what other languages we have interpreted.
Portuguese, maybe.
So please feel free to come forward. You've got someone who's beating you to the mic.
Hello, Andrew Qualley. I'm a lawyer from New York and have spent most of my career involved in Latin America. I appreciate your point that Russia has been getting away with things it shouldn't, and there needs to be a concerted effort to make it painful for them doing what they're doing. Without taking some of the thunder away from the Venezuelan program tomorrow, and I hope maybe you can participate, what would you suggest that either the United States or international organizations do to discourage and penalize, punish Russia and perhaps other proxy activities of Iran and maybe China and Cuba for its enabling and continuing the terrible tragedy that is happening in Venezuela?
Well, I am not an expert on Venezuela, but I'm sitting next to someone who is. But I'll give my 2 cents, and then I'd love to hear from Ambassador Shannon as well. I do think that we are strongest when we act together, and I think pulling together the concerned powers of the region to coordinate our policies, not only vis-a-vis the Venezuelan regime, but to your point, all of the other actors who are sometimes trying to move things in the wrong direction. Whether that is, first and foremost, very pointed diplomacy. I think thinking about economic sanctions and or also incentives in some cases. Linking things that they care about to their behavior there and having them at least have to think twice as to whether playing the spoiler, making mischief is really worth the other costs they will pay in other areas. But you have thought about 1,000 times more hours about this than most of us, so what would you say?
I might have thought more, but I think your answer was more coherent. No, I agree with what you said, and I would say the same is true for China also. The countries of the region, especially those most affected by Venezuela, need to find a way to communicate with a single voice to those who are helping to perpetuate this crisis. some for economic reasons, some for political reasons. And especially in regard to Russia, Russia's presence broadly in Latin America, but especially in South America, has been quite limited. At one point in time, there was a significant battle within the Russian national security structure over how it responded to Chinese presence in the region, with some arguing, mostly in the foreign ministry, for a return to a more Soviet-style engagement, which meant strong embassies engaged with governments pursuing strategic purposes. The Kremlin itself, however, had a very narrow approach to the region. It was largely about selling weapons and involving itself in oil and gas a business of one sort or another. And the Kremlin won out. And so Venezuela became the natural entry point into the region for a Russia that had been absent for quite some time. But what the Russians quickly discovered is that Venezuela was a blind alley, that once it got into Venezuela, it really couldn't get anywhere else. Whereas the Chinese, who came in through the large commodity-producing economies of Brazil and Argentina and Chile and others, found themselves in fertile territory to spread themselves. But the Russians have now discovered, given the crisis in Venezuela, that they have a card to play against us. And they're playing it, even though their investment there is fairly small, especially in terms of people on the ground. And so I think we need to find a way to convince the Russians that this isn't about us, that it's about how they relate to a larger region, but also to remind the Europeans that they can play a role here, because Europe is actually quite concerned about what happens inside Venezuela, because they're afraid that if Russian interests are seriously prejudiced in some fashion, or if Russia finds itself humiliated inside of Venezuela, it will exact a cost not in the Caribbean, but in Europe, in Ukraine, or in Moldova, or in the Baltics. And this is one of the reasons why the European Union and the European members of the contact group are engaged in the way they are, because they're actually playing defense in trying to ensure that whatever happens in Venezuela doesn't prejudice them in a significant way. And so the Russia issue has become a serious one. But if we try to deal with it as a bilateral issue with Russia, we're only going to play into their game. So like you said, we have to find a way to spread it out. Michael, you had a question. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, please.
Hi, Francisco Alvarez. Madam Flournoy, an honor to have you here. I'm curious about the youth vote and youth engagement across Latin America. More and more young people are having a role in what our democracy will look like, and both left-leaning and right-leaning governments are grappling with that. I'm just wondering if there are any examples or countries broadly where you see promising youth-led movements that are reshaping democracies, and do you also, and maybe Dr. Shifter can address this, do you think that youth voice is also being translated at the voting booth? Thank you.
You know, I'm going to confess my ignorance in terms of youth movements across Latin America. I can certainly say here in the United States, the youth vote is one of the crown jewels that everyone wants to capture.
Oh, we're learning from you guys.
We saw that. Look at Bernie Sanders. I mean, it's kind of ironic that probably one of the oldest, if not the oldest candidate, is the darling of American youth. But that was a very powerful wake-up call in this country that, hey, these young people are not following the pattern of their forebears. They are getting politically active and engaged much earlier than previous generations, and they are actually turning out to vote. And so I do think that, you know, any serious campaign has to take that into account. And I think it's a tremendous source of strength for democracy. The most important thing to have is an engaged citizenry. And the earlier that happens, and the more people feel that they can influence the outcome and have a voice, the healthier a democracy and a society you're going to have. So I think the one thing I'd caution is this is also a part of the population that's disproportionately influenced by what they see online. And so they are also vulnerable to the kind of social media manipulation that we've seen. And so part of the challenge is getting them to be very sophisticated users and to recognize fake news when they see it, to recognize something that doesn't sound right or doesn't seem to be authentic when they see it. But in general, I think this is a very positive trend and one that we should encourage and build on.
Well, we've just about hit our time limit, but we have one more question. So if you can ask it quickly, we'll answer it quickly.
Good evening, Mr. Secretary. My name is Simon Molina. I'm a student in international relations, and I'm focusing on campaigning and do activism for human rights across Latin America. So my really question is about military intervention in Venezuela and with support of Colombia. So what do you believe in that sense, knowing that has been talking about inside the Trump administration, and if you think there could be a risk to end up like Syria or Yemen?
Well, my personal view is that there's no military solution to the Venezuela problem. I think that if you talk to military professionals in the United States, they're very reluctant to go down this path. There's not clarity on what are the U.S. interests, what would the actual options be. What would be the response and the costs? How would this affect the humanitarian situation? Don't get me wrong. There may be aspects of military measures that can increase pressure alongside sanctions to actually finally get the government to respond to its people and step down and move forward. But a wholesale U.S. intervention to change the regime by force in Venezuela, I think, is not what the region needs, and I don't think it accords with U.S. interests or the interests of the region. And so I've said what I think. I'm pretty clear on my bottom line. But again, there may be things that we can do militarily to create pressure, to build capacity of others, to contain the instability, but a wholesale military operation to change the regime, I don't think the American people would support it. I don't think most of our national security decision makers would support it. And I don't think it would be good for the region or for the United States.
Well, Michèle, you've wonderful lead-off to our conference, an excellent way to frame issues globally as we address them regionally and locally. We want to thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Michèle.